So imagine standing on a stage
Okay.
and you're tasked with giving this big inspirational speech to thousands of newly minted, probably deeply indebted college
I
graduates.
mean, that sounds stressful enough as it is.
Right. But then instead of applause, you just get actively, aggressively booed right off the stage.
Oh, wow. I mean, that is literally the ultimate nightmare scenario for any public speaker. Easily.
Exactly. But that is exactly what happened recently at the University of Central Florida. And, it wasn't just some random disruption by a few hecklers.
Right, it was a whole crowd reaction.
Yeah, it was a massive collective rejection of the future that these students were being sold. So, welcome to the deep dive. If you're joining us today, you are the crucial third person in this room. And we really need you to look closely at this collision.
This collision between, like, technological reality and basic human survival.
Exactly. It's dominating the cultural conversation right now because we are dissecting this highly polarizing historical comparison that, uh, tech executives and politicians are just throwing around constantly these days.
Oh, you mean the idea that artificial intelligence is the next industrial revolution?
That's the one.
Which I have to say is a phrase that carries an immense amount of historical baggage.
Hmm.
And most of the people using it seem, honestly, completely oblivious to that fact.
Oblivious or just deliberately ignoring it. And so that is our mission today. We're taking the unvarnished, heavily documented history of the British Industrial Revolution.
Roughly 1760 to 1840.
Right, exactly. And we're using it as a blueprint to examine this modern AI rollout. But we are stripping away the sanitized, middle school textbook version of steam engines and glorious progress.
Oh, yeah, we have to. The reality was so much darker.
It really was. And to show you why this matters right now, we have to go straight back to that commencement stage in Florida because the setting there is incredibly important.
Yeah, and it wasn't just a general university audience, was it?
No, this was the College of Arts and Humanities, specifically the Nicholson School of Communication and Media. So picture this crowd, right? Thousands of graduating writers, illustrators, journalists, graphic designers.
Okay, so people whose entire careers are built on, like, highly specific human expression.
Yes, young adults who just spent 4 years and likely tens of thousands of dollars mastering nuanced human skills. And they are walking into an economy where multi-trillion-dollar tech companies are loudly boasting that automated systems can do those exact jobs faster and cheaper.
Which is a terrifying prospect for them.
Absolutely. So the university brings in a woman named Gloria Seifield to give the commencement address. She's a vice president at Tavistock Development Company.
Oh, Tavistock, that's a real estate firm?
Yes.
That is, I mean, that's not exactly the bleeding edge of the tech industry.
Yeah.
Which makes her choice of topic even more bizarre.
Right. So she steps up to the podium, looks out at this sea of aspiring artists and writers, and decides to open her speech by praising billionaires Jeff Bezos and Howard Schultz.
Oh, no. I mean, that is a staggering misread of the room.
It really is.
You're speaking to people who value human expression and localized individual creativity, and you offer them, like, the ultimate architects of ruthless corporate optimization and infinite scale. Like,
Yeah.
those are the role models.
The disconnect is just profound. But then she drops the hammer. She looks at these humanities graduates and confidently declares that the rapid rise of AI is the, quote, next industrial revolution.
And that's when it happens.
That's when the crowd turns on her. Thousands of people actively, vocally booing the future she's trying to inspire them with. I mean, the noise gets so overwhelming, she actually has to stop her speech.
Wow.
Yeah, she awkwardly pauses and says something like, "Oh, what happened? Okay, I struck a chord. May I finish?"
She clearly thought she was just, delivering a standard uplifting commencement platitude.
Exactly. And in her attempt to recover, she says, "Only a few years ago, AI was not a factor in our lives." And the moment she says that,
Let me guess. They cheered.
the crowd erupts into cheers. They are literally cheering for the past. Now, in the aftermath of this event, Seafield publicly labeled the crowd's reaction as bipolar.
Ugh. I mean, that's just intellectually lazy.
I find it incredibly dismissive and, frankly, completely wrong. I would argue it is a fiercely rational, totally consistent reaction.
It's basic economic logic.
Right. Like, think about your own job for a second. If the core skill you have spent the last decade perfecting was suddenly made available to the entire world as a, $20 a month software subscription.
How would you react?
Exactly. These students are cheering a past where their human skills had economic value, and they are booing a future where those skills are rendered obsolete. That's not bipolar. That is self-preservation.
Yeah, and to really understand the friction here, we have to contrast that Florida commencement with another one that was happening around the exact same time.
The NVIDIA one.
Yes. NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang delivered a commencement speech at Carnegie Mellon University.
And for those who don't know, Carnegie Mellon is like a heavy-hitting STEM school.
Precisely. It's one of the premier institutions globally for computer science, robotics, engineering. So Huang gets up there and delivers a speech entirely focused on the AI revolution.
Using essentially the same broad historical comparisons about sweeping technological change, right?
Exactly the same messaging. And the reaction, a massive standing ovation and ecstatic reception.
That is wild. So we have the exact same technology, the exact same core message about an impending industrial revolution yielding two entirely polarized reactions.
Based purely on who is sitting in the folding chairs. There's a software engineer, Cable Sasser, who has this brilliant quote that perfectly captures this dynamic.
Oh, I love this quote.
He says, when you're inside the bubble, you think everybody else is, but everybody isn't. And those Carnegie Mellon graduates, they are inside the bubble.
They're the architects of the technology.
Exactly. When they look at AI, they see an infinite expansion of their own professional value, their personal wealth, societal influence. They literally hold the controls.
While the UCF graduates are standing in the blast radius.
Yes, because the benefits and the harms of any technological revolution, they're never distributed evenly. Never.
Right.
If you are building the disruption, it looks like a miracle. If your livelihood is being dismantled by it, it looks like an apocalypse.
And that divergence, that's the perfect lens for us today. Let's actually take the phrase, the next industrial revolution, seriously. If this is truly our historical parallel, we need to know what the original revolution actually looked like for the people standing in the blast radius.
Yeah, we have to leave behind the neat little line graphs of GDP growth and look at the gritty, documented reality of 1760 to 1840.
So where do we start?
Well, the first thing we have to understand is that the British Industrial Revolution was a forced demographic shift of a magnitude the world had literally never seen.
Like a complete upending of how people lived.
Right. Before this era, for centuries, the vast majority of the population lived in localized agricultural communities. They relied on traditional farming, communal grazing lands, and localized artisanal trades.
But that wasn't dismantled by accident, was it?
No, absolutely not.
Because I think people have this idea that peasants just woke up one day, saw a factory, and went, oh, I want to go work in that smog-filled building.
Yeah, no, they didn't want that at all. The mechanism that forced them was a legal and structural process known as enclosure.
Okay, explain enclosure for us.
So over decades, the British Parliament passed thousands of enclosure acts. These were laws that essentially allowed wealthy landowners to fence off common lands.
The common lands being B.
Lands that ordinary families had relied on for generations. It was where they grazed their few animals, foraged, grew a little food. It was how they sustained themselves.
So the government actively criminalized their traditional means of survival.
Yes, they completely privatized the landscape.
Yeah.
Without access to the commons, subsistence farming became totally impossible for the lower classes.
They basically pulled the rug out from under them.
Exactly. And simultaneously, you had the invention of mechanized looms. So skilled artisans like hand loom weavers who worked out of their own homes and controlled their own hours.
They suddenly couldn't compete.
Right. They couldn't compete with the sheer volume of cheap textiles being pumped out by the new water and steam-powered factories.
So their lifelong skills were automated away practically overnight. I mean, the parallel to our humanities graduates is chilling.
It really is. The economic floor completely fell out from under these workers. They were forced to migrate to urban centers, not out of a desire for, progress, but literally to avoid starvation.
They had to adapt to a highly exploitative wage labor system where they had zero leverage.
Zero. And the conditions of that new system were horrific.
Yeah, our sources detail the staggering reliance on child labor. And I want to be very clear here, because when people hear child labor today, they might think of teenagers working a summer job at a grocery store.
Oh, it was nothing like that.
No. We are talking about children as young as 5 years old, working 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week.
And we need to explain why this specific form of labor was so heavily utilized. It wasn't just because children were cheap to employ, though of course they were paid a tiny fraction of an adult's wage.
Right.
It was actually a structural requirement of the early machinery.
How so? Like, why did they specifically need kids?
Well, the newly invented textile machines, particularly the massive power looms and spinning mules, They were incredibly primitive by modern standards. They were just constantly jamming.
Okay.
Threads would snap, dust and lint would clog up the gears. So to keep the factory running at maximum efficiency, owners needed workers small enough to literally crawl underneath these massive, violently fast-moving machines to sweep up the dust and tie broken threads.
Wait, well, the machines are actively running.
Yes. Or the child would crawl under a stock machine to clear a jam, and because there were no safety protocols or communication systems, the operator would just restart the machine without warning.
Oh my God.
The historical records, like the parliamentary inquiries from the era, they're filled with the gruesome results of this. Children routinely lost fingers, hands, entire arms.
The sources mention some were crushed to death.
Yeah, it was a regular occurrence.
And the stats from the sources note that in some British factories in the early 1800s, children under the age of 14 made up over 50% of the entire workforce.
Half the factory floor.
More than half. And they were facing these hazards daily. And if a child was injured, they were just fired. If they were killed, there was absolutely no compensation to the family. They were simply replaced by the next starving family migrating from the countryside.
The cruelty was just baked into the business model. It was viewed by the industrialists as, an acceptable overhead cost.
Which is sickening.
Yeah.
But the textile mills weren't even the worst of it. Let's talk about the coal mines, because coal was the literal fuel of this revolution.
Right.
What was happening underground. Because the sources on this they're incredibly grim.
The mines were arguably worse. Because coal seams could be very narrow, mine owners dug shafts that were sometimes only 16 inches high.
16 inches?
Yes, an adult could not physically fit into them. So they used children. They called them hurriers.
And the details of a hurrier's job from the sources are almost impossible to stomach. A 5- or 6-year-old child would be stripped naked or down to just a single garment because the heat deep underground was suffocating.
Yeah, and then they had a heavy leather belt strapped around their waist.
Right, with a chain attached to the front of the belt, passed between their legs, and hooked to a massive cart of coal.
And they had to pull that cart, crawling on their hands and knees through pitch black, 16-inch high tunnels for 14 hours a day.
It's hard to even picture that.
The physical toll on their developing bodies was permanent. Their spines were deformed, their growth was totally stunted, and their lungs were just filled with coal dust.
The sources also mention that arriving late for your 14-hour shift in the dark could mean a severe physical beating from the overseer. And if an exhausted child simply dozed off for a moment, they could easily be crushed by a cart or fall down a shaft. Like, this wasn't an anomaly. This was the foundational infrastructure of the era.
Which brings us right back to the modern rhetoric. Because when a tech executive stands on a stage today and breezily refers to the Industrial Revolution as a time of profound change and exciting opportunity.
They are engaged in historical erasure of the highest order.
Completely.
Okay, let me offer an analogy to capture what that erasure actually feels like. Because comparing the AI rollout to the Industrial Revolution as a purely positive thing, it's like looking at a gleaming, ultra-modern, high-speed rail system.
I like this.
And you're marveling at how fast it gets you from city to city while actively ignoring the fact that the people who previously lived on that land were evicted and their children were forced to lay the tracks with their bare hands under the threat of starvation.
Right.
You have the train, sure. The train is a technological marvel. But the human cost of building the track was absolute carnage.
That is a highly accurate structural analogy. The train is real, the progress is real, but the collateral damage was catastrophic for those who had to endure the construction phase.
The construction phase.
Exactly. And what is terrifying for the modern worker, for the graphic designer whose portfolio just became obsolete, is that we are currently entering our own construction phase.
The anxiety is identical. It's the sudden, terrifying realization that the rules of the economic game have been completely rewritten while you were actively playing it.
Yeah.
The skills you invested your life in are being systematically devalued by an automated process that you have no control over whatsoever. So the UCF graduates aren't facing the physical dangers of a 19th century textile loom crushing their hands, thankfully, but they are facing the exact same structural displacement.
Right, because to the person holding the capital, Industrial Revolution means unprecedented efficiency and wealth generation. But to the worker holding the obsolete skill, it means a generational struggle for relevance and basic survival.
Let's expand on that struggle. Because if we look beyond the factory walls and examine the broader societal impacts, specifically regarding health and wealth, the historical data completely shatters a myth that technological progress instantly improves human life.
Oh, absolutely. I want to dive into the period roughly between 1820 and 1870.
Okay, let's do it.
Because this is perhaps the most damning piece of the historical record, and it runs counter to everything we are taught in basic economics.
Yeah.
We assume this direct correlation, right? Better technology equals more goods, which equals a higher standard of living.
Right, the rising tide lifts all boats.
Exactly. But during the absolute apex of the British industrial explosion, life expectancy in England completely stagnated for 50 years.
Wait. How is that mathematically possible? If you have steam power, mechanized agriculture, mass production of goods, shouldn't basic human survival rates go up just by virtue of society having a massive surplus of resources?
It seems totally counterintuitive until you examine the mechanism of urbanization, because that surplus of wealth wasn't being used to build infrastructure for the workers. It was being intensely concentrated at the top.
Ah, of course.
The sudden influx of displaced rural workers caused towns to explode into cities virtually overnight, so a town of a few thousand people suddenly had 50,000 people crammed into it.
Absolutely zero urban planning.
None. There was no sewage system, no clean water distribution, no trash collection. Families were crammed into single damp cellar rooms in these massive tenement buildings. And because the infrastructure failed, the biological reality of living that close together just took over.
The sources highlight this grim stat. Working-class life expectancy at birth in major industrial towns like Manchester and Leeds plummeted to between 25 and 35 years.
It's unbelievable.
Decades into the revolution, people were dying younger in the cities than their grandparents did in the countryside.
Yeah. And it wasn't just infant mortality bringing the average down, though that was terrible. The environment itself was incredibly toxic. The primary mechanism of disease was contaminated water.
Right, because of the lack of sanitation.
Exactly. When you have tens of thousands of people lacking basic sanitation, human waste invariably leaches into the drinking water. This led to rampant, recurring epidemics of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery,
Just sweeping through the working-class slums.
wiping out entire families in a matter of days.
And above them, the air was literally poisonous. The National Bureau of Economic Research, the NDER, conducted a fascinating retrospective study on the impact of coal use during this era. What exactly did they find there?
So they quantified the biological and economic impact of all that relentless industrial pollution, because the dense black smoke from the factory smokestacks basically blocked out the sun.
Leading to things like rickets, right?
Yeah, right. Widespread vitamin D deficiencies. But more severely, the constant inhalation of soot just decimated lung health. The NBER study found that growing industrial coal use between 1851 and 1900 alone reduced overall life expectancy by at least half a year on average.
Wow. And they actually attached a dollar figure to that suffering, didn't they?
They did. They calculated the economic cost of that lost life, the sheer human attrition, as being equivalent to roughly 0.3% to 1% of the total annual GDP.
So the economy was growing, but it was physically cannibalizing its own workforce to do it.
Precisely.
So if I understand the timeline from the sources correctly, economists look at consumption patterns to measure standard of living, right?
Yes.
And they found that there was only a minuscule rise in consumption for the average person between 1760 and 1820.
Correct. That is 60 years of near total economic stagnation for the working class.
60 years. That means if you were a worker born in 1760, you lived your entire life, broke your body in the factories, raised children who also worked in the factories, and died without ever seeing a meaningful economic benefit from the revolution your labor fueled.
Yeah.
You just got the smoke, the cholera, and the grueling shifts.
The rapid improvement in the standard of living that we associate with modernity didn't really accelerate until much, much later. And even then, researchers argue the unmeasured costs of pollution and psychological trauma heavily offset that slight rise in wages.
Right.
The Industrial Revolution made the British Empire vastly richer, but it made the average worker sicker and poorer for the better part of a century.
And that leads us directly to the explosion of inequality. The wealth generated by mechanization was unprecedented in human history.
Good.
The factory owners created an entirely new class of ultra-wealthy industrial elites. Meanwhile, the people operating the machines earned subsistence wages that barely kept them alive. The gap between the people generating the wealth and the people capturing the wealth widened exponentially decade after decade.
And this is where the historical bridge to our current AI rollout becomes incredibly sturdy and deeply uncomfortable.
Yeah, let's build that bridge.
Because we are currently living through an explosion of wealth generation tied almost exclusively to the tech sector, while simultaneously witnessing a severe regression in the economic mobility of the average citizen.
Right. Let's look at the housing market as the prime example of that, because housing is the foundational metric for middle-class stability and wealth generation. The modern numbers provided in our sources paint a brutal picture of 2025 inequality.
They really do.
In 2025, the ratio of U.S. home prices to median household income hit a near record 5.1.
And to understand how drastic that shift is, we have to look back. In 1985, that ratio was 3.1. So the cost of shelter has completely decoupled from what average human labor actually pays.
The mechanics of that decoupling are terrifying. The sources note that right now, 65% of American households cannot afford a newly built, medium-priced home.
65%.
They are mathematically locked out of the market. And the demographic shift is stark, too. In the 1980s, the median age of a first-time home buyer was 29.
Right.
Today, it has been pushed to 40 years old.
That's an entire decade. An entire decade of wealth building, equity accumulation, and family stability has just been erased for the modern worker.
So think about that UCF graduate again. They are entering the workforce saddled with unprecedented student debt, facing an extraordinarily hostile housing market where they're priced out of owning a home until middle age.
Right.
And they're looking at a future where their wages are likely to stagnate or their jobs disappear entirely due to generative AI.
And while they face that highly precarious reality, the architects of this technology, the CEOs pushing the AI revolution, are becoming quite literally the wealthiest individuals in the history of the human species.
We are talking about personal fortunes tied to trillion-dollar market caps that rival the GDP of entire nations.
And these are the exact same executives standing on commencement stages telling indebted, anxious 22-year-olds that this technology is an exciting opportunity.
It is the identical dynamic of the 19th century mill owner telling the destitute hand weaver that the power loom is a marvel of human achievement.
It is true from the vantage point of the owner, but it is a systemic failure for the weaver.
Exactly.
And what compounds this inequality, both historically and presently, is the complete failure of our political institutions to protect the vulnerable during these periods of hyper-rapid change.
Which brings us to the political infrastructure of disenfranchisement. How do the systems governing the people fail so spectacularly to protect them when the economic ground shifts? To answer that, we have to talk about my absolute favorite historical concept from our sources.
Ah, the rotten boroughs.
Yes, the rotten boroughs.
They are the perfect encapsulation of a political system that has completely lost touch with demographic and economic reality, yet refuses to change because it serves the elites.
Okay, so break down the mechanics of this for anyone unfamiliar with pre-1832 British parliamentary history. How did a rotten borough actually function legally?
Okay, so the British political system at the time was based on electoral constituencies that had been drawn up centuries earlier, like during the medieval period.
Right.
Over hundreds of years, the population naturally moved, and the economy shifted from agriculture to industry. But the political map was never updated.
So you had a frozen political landscape overlaid on a rapidly changing physical landscape.
Exactly. And this created these bizarre, archaic entities known as rotten boroughs. These were districts that had once been thriving medieval towns, but had since depopulated to almost nothing.
Right.
In some cases, the actual land had fallen into the sea due to coastal erosion, or had been turned entirely into a sheep pasture owned by a single wealthy aristocrat.
But legally, they still retained their parliamentary representation.
Yes.
The sources give this mind-blowing statistic that a village with literally 12 residents could elect 2 members of parliament.
2 MPs for 12 people.
You had 2 powerful voices in the national government representing what was effectively a vacant lot controlled by a local lord.
Meanwhile, look at what was happening on the other side of the country. You had Manchester.
Manchester was the beating, smog-filled industrial heart of the entire revolution. It was one of the largest, most economically vital, and densely populated cities in the entire British Empire.
And how many members of parliament did the hundreds of thousands of people living and working in Manchester have?
0. Absolutely 0 representation.
None.
The city powering the national economy, the city where workers were dying of cholera and losing limbs in factories, had no legal voice whatsoever in the system governing their lives.
The statistics from the 1831 election highlight just how fundamentally rigged the system was. Out of 406 elected members of parliament, 152 of them were chosen by constituencies with fewer than 100 voters each.
That's crazy.
50 constituencies had fewer than 50 voters. The entire legislative apparatus was designed for a feudal world that just no longer existed.
Let's give the listener an analogy to really ground this. If you're listening to this in America today, how should you visualize the sheer absurdity of the rotten borough system?
Imagine if today a congressional district in rural Wyoming with a total population of 30 people had the exact same voting power and congressional representation as the entire city of Chicago.
Oh, wow.
30 people having the same legislative weight as nearly 3 million people.
And imagine that when the citizens of Chicago demanded representation, when they demanded a voice in how their taxes were spent and how their lives were governed, the elites in Washington vehemently refused.
Right. Imagine them arguing that giving Chicago a voice would destroy the fundamental fabric of American governance.
That's precisely what the British aristocracy argued in the early 1800s. They claimed that reforming the rotten boroughs would lead directly to mob rule and anarchy.
They pointed to the French Revolution as proof that giving the working class a voice would end in the guillotine. They were aggressively protecting their extraction system.
And here is where the deep dive gets incredibly relevant to your life right now. Because the sources argue that the concept of the rotten borough hasn't disappeared, it has simply sheep-shifted.
Yes.
The disenfranchisement is no longer based on medieval electoral maps. Today, it is based on the physical infrastructure of the AI revolution. Let's talk about data centers.
We really have to remember that artificial intelligence does not actually exist in the cloud. It's not magic. It is intensely physical.
It requires massive hyperscale data centers containing tens of thousands of specialized servers to process the massive amounts of data required for large language models.
And running those servers generates an unbelievable amount of heat. So you need electricity to power the servers, and you need a staggering volume of water to cool them down.
We are talking about millions of gallons of water consumed daily through evaporative cooling towers.
And where is this infrastructure being built? Because these facilities require vast amounts of cheap land, power, and water, tech giants are rapidly constructing them in municipalities in places like Georgia, Maryland, and Virginia.
This is where the modern rotten borough mechanism kicks in. The parallel is resource extraction without meaningful local consent.
Exactly. These massive corporate conglomerates, often operating through shell companies with generic LLC names to hide their identity, during the land buying phase, they come into a local municipality.
Right.
They negotiate massive water and power usage agreements, often requiring non-disclosure agreements from local officials.
So the local communities, the people who actually live there, are entirely sidelined.
Yes, they're the ones who will bear the brunt of the strain on the local power grid, the severe depletion of local aquifers, and the constant droning noise pollution from the industrial cooling fans.
But they have effectively no power to stop it. The sources cite a highly specific, chilling example of this dynamic from Georgia.
Oh, the water extraction case.
Yeah. A county water director discovered that a subsidiary of Blackstone, which is one of the largest private equity firms in the world, heavily investing in data centers, was engaging in unauthorized water extraction.
To be clear, they were physically pulling massive amounts of water from the local supply that they were not legally permitted to take, straining the local infrastructure.
Right. And when the county water director confronted the company about this blatant, unauthorized extraction, the company representative literally brushed the concern off.
What did they call it?
The representative referred to their unauthorized water drain as a customer service issue.
Wow. It is a breathtaking display of corporate arrogance. But it perfectly illustrates the power dynamic of the modern era.
Definitely.
To the trillion-dollar tech giant or private equity firm, the local community isn't a constituency with democratic rights or valid concerns. It is merely a resource pool to be managed and extracted from.
That is exactly my point. The citizens of that Georgia county are the modern citizens of Manchester in 1830. In the 1800s, Manchester couldn't vote to improve its toxic air or unsafe factories because the national political system was rigged against them.
And today?
Today, a local town in Virginia finds that its zoning laws, its municipal water boards, its local political levers are completely overpowered by the sheer legal and capital force of tech monopolies.
They are disenfranchised by bureaucracy, NDAs, and overwhelming capital, rather than by archaic parliamentary districts. But the result is functionally identical, isn't it?
It really is. The people living with the immediate physical consequences of the technology have no voice in how it is deployed in their own backyards.
Which brings us to a critical myth that we have to dismantle. It's the dangerous assumption baked into the phrase the next industrial revolution. The assumption that technology inherently bends toward justice.
Ah, yes, the Silicon Valley ethos. Move fast and break things, and the market will eventually fix the world.
Right. The belief is that if we just let the engineers build the AI and let the market deploy it without friction, society will automatically get better, the wealth will eventually trickle down, and any displacement will sort itself out organically.
But if we actually look at the timeline of reform during the original Industrial Revolution, that assumption is exposed as a total fabrication.
Absolutely. The Industrial Revolution did not just get better on its own. The free market did not look at 5-year-olds losing fingers and power looms and self-corrector.
No, it required massive, grinding, generation-long legislative reform, and the elites fought those reforms tooth and nail at every single stage.
The timeline of the labor laws is exhausting just to review. I mean, the very first attempt at regulation was the Health and Morals of Apprentices Act of 1802.
And what did that act actually do?
Very little, honestly. It was explicitly designed to improve the conditions of apprentices, which was just a polite term for orphaned children who were essentially sold by poorhouses to mill owners.
So,
It mandated basic things like providing decent clothing and limiting their work to 12 hours a day. But it had a massive loophole.
which was?
It didn't apply to free children who lived with their parents, so owners just shifted to hiring the starving children of displaced rural workers.
Right, so by historical consensus, the 1802 Act was absolutely futile. It was poorly enforced because there were no independent inspectors, it was easily bypassed, and it completely failed to stop the industrial-scale exploitation of children. So the suffering simply continued, unabated.
And the sources point out that it took another 30 years of relentless public agitation, horrifying medical reports, organizing by reformers, and intense political pressure just to get to the Factory Act of 1833.
30 years. Stop and think about what a 30-year gap means in human terms. That is an entire generation of human beings born into the slums, sent into the factories at age 6, living their entire shortened lives under the threat of those machines, and dying before the law meaningfully changed.
And even the 1833 Act was a compromise. I mean, it finally outlawed the employment of children under 9 in textile mills and limited children aged 9 to 13 to a maximum of 9 hours a day.
Still 9 hours for a 9-year-old.
Right. Crucially, though, it established the first factory inspectors. But, and this is the kicker, they only appointed 4 inspectors for the entire country.
4 guys.
Yeah.
4 guys to inspect thousands of mills. It just shows you how deeply resistant the system was to checking its own power.
Yes.
And what is truly vital to understand is the rhetorical strategy used by the elites to fight these basic humane reforms. When reformers push for limits on child labor or for the establishment of a maximum 10-hour workday for adults, the factory owners push back with apocalyptic warnings.
I think we need to steel man the factory owner's argument here to understand why it was so persuasive to Parliament at the time. Because the British Empire was engaged in massive global conflicts, including the Napoleonic Wars for part of this era. The factory owners argued that the sheer volume of cheap textiles they were producing was the economic engine keeping the empire afloat.
So they wrapped their profit motive in the flag of national security.
Exactly.
Let me play the role of the industrialist, or really the modern tech executive, because the arguments are completely interchangeable. If I'm sitting in front of a regulatory committee today, I say, look, if you regulate our AI models, if you put these artificial constraints on our innovation and deployment, you are going to destroy the economy.
You're going to stifle our edge.
Yes. We will lose the AI arms race to other countries, and our entire economic system will collapse.
That is verbatim, almost word for word, what the 19th century mill owners testified before Parliament regarding the 10-hour workday.
Unbelievable.
They argued that foreign competition was fierce, that their margins were razor thin, and that all of their actual profit was made in the final 2 hours of a 14-hour shift.
Of course they did.
They solemnly promised that if they were restricted to a 10-hour day, the mills would be forced to close, millions would be unemployed, and the British economy would be annihilated.
And what is the historical punchline to that incredibly confident prediction?
The punchline is that they were entirely, spectacularly wrong. Parliament, facing massive pressure from the working class, eventually passed the reforms. The 10-hour workday was implemented, and the economy didn't collapse.
The factories didn't close.
British industry continued to dominate the globe for the rest of the century. The apocalyptic predictions from the elites were exposed as complete fabrications.
They weren't economic truths. They were simply convenient excuses deployed to protect maximum profit margins at the direct expense of human lives.
Exactly. And we're seeing the exact same cycle play out with modern AI regulation. The new technology rolls out incredibly fast. Ordinary people suffer the immediate displacement.
The artists lose their freelance contracts, the coders see their entry-level jobs vanish, the local communities lose their water pressure.
The researchers and journalists document the harm.
Then the tech elites resist any oversight, claiming that even the mildest regulation will destroy the future and hand victory to our geopolitical rivals. But the people organize. They push back.
Whether it's filing lawsuits over copyrighted training data, demanding transparency in local zoning boards, or, yes, booing a tone-deaf executive on a commencement stage. Eventually, the political system is forced by the people to catch up with the technological reality.
It is always a struggle for power. History shows us unequivocally that technological progress only becomes societal progress when ordinary people force the issue.
Right. The benefits we now associate with the Industrial Revolution, the weekends, the minimum wage, occupational safety laws, the abolition of child labor, environmental protections.
None of these were gifts bestowed by benevolent factory owners who suddenly grew a conscience.
No, they were won. They were won through blood, sweat, strikes, and relentless political struggle by labor movements and reformers who refused to accept that human suffering was the mandatory price of progress.
So, if we synthesize all of this, if we pull all these historical threads together to answer our core mission today, is artificial intelligence the next industrial revolution?
Based on the deep dive into the sources, the answer is a resounding yes. It very likely is.
But we have to recognize that this is not a purely inspirational talking point.
No, it is a glaring historical warning.
It is a massive warning siren. Admitting that AI is the next industrial revolution means we are staring down the barrel of a potential centuries worth of severe economic displacement, brutal labor exploitation, invasive environmental extraction, and skyrocketing inequality.
It means the transition is going to be incredibly painful. And history dictates that the pain will be borne almost entirely by the working and middle classes, while the wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few trillion-dollar monopolies.
The crucial takeaway for anyone listening to this, whether you are a student, a creative professional, or someone living near a proposed data center, is to recognize your place in the historical continuum.
Every single generation that has enjoyed the modern benefits of the original Industrial Revolution has only done so because previous generations paid the horrific physical cost and fought a grinding war for reform.
We inherited the train, but we didn't have to break our backs laying the tracks. We are the beneficiaries of the factory acts, the labor organizers, and the environmental regulations that legally force capital to value human life over absolute efficiency.
But right now, a new track is being laid. An entirely new infrastructure of extraction and automation is being built all around us.
And the critical question of our time, the question that will define the next 50 years of human history, is this. How long will we wait for the reforms this time? Will the regulations that protect workers' livelihoods, intellectual property rights, and local environmental resources come in year 5 of this revolution?
Or will we passively wait until year 60, after an entire generation has been economically hollowed out?
Will local communities organize and demand transparency, holding the builders of these massive AI data centers accountable? Or will ordinary citizens find themselves entirely disenfranchised, forced to file Freedom of Information Act requests just to figure out why their local river is running dry to cool down a server farm?
Are we going to blindly accept a new era of digital rotten boroughs where tech monopolies hold all the political leverage and the citizens hold none?
It is not a foregone conclusion. History rhymes, but it doesn't have to repeat the exact same tragic verses. But changing the rhyme scheme requires active participation.
It requires looking at the technology not just with awe at its capabilities, but with a highly critical, historically informed eye regarding its costs.
Absolutely. You cannot just cheer for the machine. You have to ask who owns the machine and who is being fed into it.
Yeah.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. Something for you to really mull over the next time you hear a CEO promise you a utopian future.
I think we all need this.
Throughout this hour, we've looked back at the 1800s, and we naturally shudder at the blatant, normalized exploitation of the era. We look at the 5-year-olds chained to coal carts, the lack of political representation in a booming city like Manchester, the cholera in the water, and we think, how could they possibly have tolerated that in the name of progress? How could an entire society be so willingly blind to the human cost?
Yeah.
Well, flash forward. Decades from now, when the historians of the future look back at the 2020s, when they look back at the rapid, unregulated deployment of this new AI revolution, what will they shudder at? What modern-day equivalent of the rotten boroughs, or what unmeasured human cost, perhaps the psychological toll of mass economic obsolescence, the loss of human cognitive autonomy, or the quiet environmental devastation of hyperscale computing, will they be absolutely shocked that we willingly tolerated simply because someone on a stage promised us it was the future?
That is the question we all need to be asking.
Next time you hear a commencement speaker tell you to embrace the revolution, remember the booze in Florida. Remember that questioning the architects of the future and fighting for your own economic survival is the most rational, historically justified thing you can do. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems being built around you, and we'll see you next time.